Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. And as usual, I hope you've been well. And we, who are we? The Platonic, or if you like, Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus asks at one point in his Enneads, written about 17 and a half centuries ago. He's talking about human identity in the most fundamental and universal sense. What is the self, or the soul, or the personality, or the psyche, really? Today we're going to be talking about how the answer to this question is essential to understanding our own desire, which I think is in turn essential to being better and happier people. And we're also going to see how the classic Platonic answer to this question, or at least the essential elements of it, can crop up in places that might surprise us. If you've been watching the last several episodes, you'll know we've been making our way through the Phaedrus, Plato's second most important work on Eros. And we came here in search of an answer to a question. That question arose from something Diotima the prophetess had said in his most important work on Eros, the Symposium. And that was, of course, her claim that all humans desire, really, is nothing but the good. Our explorations then took us to this fundamental principle of the Platonic tradition, that the good is the one, subjective and objective reality as one. So that what Diotima seems to be saying is that somehow the object of our desire is, in some kind of paradoxical way, not an object, but rather ecstatic union with reality, in which this division that prevails in our everyday lives between subject and object is in some way transcended or overcome. We may or may not have found this idea kind of consciousness expanding, but we may also have found that by itself it really doesn't seem to suffice to explain what Diotima could have meant by saying that all humans' desire is the good. I mean, do we really see ourselves and our fellow human beings motivated solely by a desire for some kind of ecstasy of truth, some kind of, if you like, mystical union? In a way, it seems really kind of far-fetched. So this brings me to why I think we're at a particularly exciting juncture in this series. After having passed through what is kind of preliminary material in this dialogue, the Phaedrus, we'll be diving in to what I think really is its heart, an immensely powerful myth of the psyche that, in my view, unlocks this great problem that Diotima's seemingly wild claim seemed to create. What we'll eventually see is that this craving for oneness with reality, far from being the preserve of a small, mystically minded minority of humanity, is actually universal, and it manifests itself on the most basic level in our everyday lives. You might remember that when we left off, Socrates had just claimed that madness, or mania, the Greek word is, doesn't have to be bad. In fact, he said, a certain kind of mania is given to us by the gods for, quote, our greatest happiness. And he said he would prove this. Now he begins his proof by, in his words, first explaining the nature of the psyche, how it is acted upon, he says, and how it acts. And he'll do that, as I mentioned, by means of a myth. And there are really two parts to this myth. As we'll see, the first part seems in a way to echo the wild or naive optimism, if you like, that we seemed to see in Diotima's claim. There seems an idea of human nature as in some sense untouched by negativity. The psyche, Socrates claims, is by its nature eternal, and in the myth he relates, psyches or souls naturally live in heaven with the gods, and sometimes some of these souls even glimpse the place beyond heaven in which the gods feast. So I think we can here try to open up this imagery a bit. I think when Plato talks about the psyche being immortal, we can understand this as meaning he understands that it in some sense transcends this everyday world of subject and object, this world that's pervaded with limit, with all the limits of time, including the ultimate limit, death. So there's a kind of timelessness that the psyche lives. And when he talks about the gods, he's talking about the principles of reality, goodness, unity, and or, I think, the forces that manifest these things in nature. And it's clear that what he means by this place beyond heaven in which the gods feast is really truth itself, which we now know in the Platonic tradition is also goodness itself and unity itself. He says, "What is in this place is without color and without shape and without solidity, being that really is what it is, the subject of all true knowledge, visible only to intelligence, the soul's steersman." And those souls that feast upon this, Socrates says, are in a state of bliss, both perfectly happy and perfectly good. And this bliss, he says, is in some way the original state of the psyche. Socrates tells Phaedrus a bit later, "We gazed in rapture at sacred revealed objects that were perfect and simple and unshakable and blissful. That was the ultimate vision, and we saw it in pure light because we were pure ourselves." You might remember that when we were talking about the symposium, we talked a bit about what the Greeks called daimons, these intermediaries between gods and mortals that sometimes attach themselves to individuals. And I'd mentioned that this great Renaissance Platonist Marsilio Ficino had said that the same daimon spoke through both Plato and Plotinus. We might not be surprised then that Plotinus, after posing his question, "Who are we?" echoes Plato in his response. He writes, "In fact, we were there." Now, this is kind of interesting, I think. The translation I'm using by this, I think I mentioned it in an earlier episode, this team of scholars headed by University of Toronto's Lloyd Gerson, renders this passage, "We were in the intelligible world." But Plotinus, and that's not an uncommon way to translate this Greek word. Plotinus uses this Greek word eke, meaning there. His Greek says simply, and more cryptically, "We were there." We were there, he says, pure souls, and intellect united with the whole of substance, parts of the intelligible, neither bounded off nor cut off. And what is there, he writes, is primeval, from the beginning. So somehow our primal state, in a way that's hard to explain other than through myth and using these kind of metaphors of space and time, primal state is a oneness with reality. I've been speaking recently about how contemporary philosophy can take this rather skeptical approach to the idea of existential unity. We've seen how Wittgenstein sort of set this pattern of thinking that although unitive, or if you like, mystical states seem to exist, people seem to experience them, they fall outside the scope of philosophy. And neither Bertrand Russell nor Rebecca Goldstein, for example, seem interested in, or possibly even aware of, the possibility that they might actually be at the heart of Platonic philosophy, existential oneness, that is. Well, I think there is, at the same time, another strand in our modern Western culture, actually, I think, a real receptivity at the same time to the idea of some kind of primal or fundamental goodness and unity of the psyche. It's a tendency that I think kind of flowered in the late 1960s counterculture, and which has been in some ways both bypassed and yet also in some way very influential on our culture today. And I'd like to single out one particular instance of that because it seems to relate particularly well to this point that we're at in the Phaedrus. In 1969, more than 17 centuries after Plotinus asked, "Who are we?" Joni Mitchell answered it in song. Excuse me. The song is called Woodstock, and it was covered a number of times, most notably by her friends Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. As she calls them, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, etc., etc. And then a British band called Matthew's Southern Comfort. And of course, it's about the historic 1969 music festival. And by the way, that music festival actually didn't call itself a music festival. It was, in fact, billed as a, quote, Aquarian exposition, unquote, featuring 3 days of peace and music. And as I record this, there's actually on YouTube a video of Joni Mitchell performing this song live to studio in 1970. I found it interesting to watch, partly because the song and her introduction to it both seem to present a juxtaposition of seemingly opposite elements. I found myself struck by how young and, in a way, kind of charmingly innocent she seems in this video, almost giggly at points. This is the video where I saw her make that joke about Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, etc., etc. And also not a little self-deprecating, not unlike Socrates himself, as we've seen. She says, "I wrote a little song for my friends to sing." And then as an apparent afterthought, she says, "and for myself to sing as well." And that's how she introduces the song. And then suddenly we seem to be taken to a very different place when she launches into these very serious sounding piano chords. And when she opens her mouth to sing, she seems somehow to gain this striking confidence and self-assertiveness, as though she has suddenly gained decades in maturity, perhaps from a power not entirely her own, or at least not from herself, as we conventionally understand the self in the everyday. Of course, the song doesn't mention Plato, and I have no idea if Joni Mitchell herself ever read the Phaedrus. But, you know, the history of thought has a way of operating by means of these intricate, labyrinthine, sort of secret passages of influence. And once you've read these Platonic writings and then come back to the song, it's hard not to sense these Platonic themes, however they might have found their way there, to sense in some way the presence of the daimon of Plato. We see, for example, the question of Plotinus implicitly raised again in this song. I don't know who I am, Mitchell sings at one point, but life is for learning. And immediately after this line, we have her response. Significant because since it's the chorus, it's repeated several times in the song, and it kind of explains or elaborates on this idea of kinship with the divine that she suggested at the very beginning of the song when she sings of coming upon a, quote, child of God, unquote. And it's kind of implied that this person is a child of God by virtue of their humanity merely. Anyway, expressed in this chorus is this sense that this condition in which we find ourselves in the everyday is not really our true one, that in some way our true state is heavenly, radiant, and pure. It is life in a garden of unity with nature, with the other. We are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Of course, some of the images in this song, I think the idea of a return to a primordial garden seem to come from Christianity. But we also have here this, as I mentioned earlier, kind of wild optimism that we seemed to see in Diotima's claim that all humans really want in some way is the good. And actually, I think this also was where a lot of skepticism and ridicule that met the 1960s flower people came from, that they seemed to not really acknowledge the reality of negativity or evil, if you like. But, and I think this is massively significant, not just for understanding Plato, but for the improvement of our own lives, there's more to Plato's myth than this. Much more. And in fact, there's more to the song Woodstock than this sort of rose-colored view of human nature. The song actually does acknowledge, as will Plato's myth, the existence of the negative. We are caught in the devil's bargain, she sings toward the end. There's a sense that a rupture from a natural state of oneness has taken away the psyche's natural freedom. Something has caused it to live as though it were almost a kind of machine. I feel to be a cog in something turning, she sings. Then finally, the song also carries this theme of resolution or restoration of the kind of primal bliss. The psyche has the power to free itself by in some way returning to that state of oneness with nature, oneness with the other. I'm going to camp out on the land. I'm going to try and get my soul free, the wandering traveler tells the narrator, who then asks, then can I walk beside you? And then the song ends with a kind of miracle. The protagonist mentions dreaming that bombers flying overhead have turned into butterflies. So what can all this mean? Is Mitchell's song just sort of New Age claptrap? And are the Platonic themes that seem to surface in it and shape it simply relics of an outdated philosophy, one that held sway before humans learned the power of René Descartes' clear and distinct ideas, and of knowing to be silent, as Wittgenstein urged us, about things of which one cannot speak? Well, I think there is a kind of caveat here. Plato tends to use myth when he finds the subject matter particularly difficult to explain using more ordinary abstract language, and this is the case here also. He often talks about finding the psyche very difficult to really talk about. Later in the dialogue, Socrates will look back on this speech and reflect that this way of explaining things through myth has its drawbacks. It can also be prone to error. He says with his typical self-deprecation, quote, "We used a certain sort of image to describe erotic passion. Perhaps it had a measure of truth in it, though it may also have led us astray." I think one risk of being led astray, actually, is that we stick to this level of images when we don't try to penetrate them and translate them into abstract, universal terms, because only when we do this, I think, can we really make them our own. There's something about human nature that needs this explication. And when we do make them our own, we may find ourselves more empowered to live better lives than we would have thought possible. That's actually what I'll be trying to do with respect to this myth in the next few episodes. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.